Hey, seventh graders. We are now continuing with our reading of chapter 12 in the Midwife's Apprentice. And as we continue with our story today, I want you to think in these next two chapters, I want you to find four places in the two chapters where you're going to stop and record into your flag it with your little post-it flags, four separate places, and then you're going to record in your DMB on Wit and Wisdom notes. You're going to record four places where you see Alice when you notice how Alice is feeling about herself. So find four times in this the next two chapters, chapter 12 and 13, where you find that it's an important message for how the author is showing us what Alice is feeling about herself. And then you're just going to flag it. And then after you write your flags, then you're going to record it into your DMB under Wit and Wisdom notes. You're just going to make a quick note of on page 20 and page 78, Alice was feeling this about herself. On page 94, Alice was feeling this about herself. Okay, so four times. So just stop the recording when I get to a point where that's an important part that I think I want to record. I will try to remember to help you as we're going through this in our first chapter. Okay, chapter 12, the inn. The cat was hungry. He pushed at the lumpish weight that was holding him down, spitting and scratching until Alice shifted and he could crawl out to see what creatures there were about that were both good to eat and easy to catch. His exertions woke Alice, and she sat up and looked about her. At first she made to stretch and smile and face a new fine day, and then she remembered. It was afternoon. She was a failure, and she had run away. It was beginning to rain, and she faced a night outside alone in the wet. She curled up again into a wet, soggy ball. I am nothing, she whispered to herself. I have nothing. I can do nothing. I learn nothing. I belong to no place. I'm too stupid to be a midwife's apprentice and too tired to wander again. I should just lie here in the rain until I die. And she fell again into a dreamless sleep. So, seventh graders, I think that would be a great spot to put your first flag. How is she feeling about herself? Well, pulling the quote right from the page. I am nothing. So she's feeling pretty depressed that she has had to leave the midwife, Jane's house, and she's out and about and she doesn't know how she's going to continue to move on. So she's feeling pretty desperate. So please flag that with your little post-it flag and please record that statement giving me a page number. On page 72, it says, quote, I am nothing. We are practicing finding textual evidence from our stories. We're lifting the pages from the book, from the text, and we're putting them down and using them. By her saying that, this proves. Okay, remember that's what we're working on. This proves that the author is showing us. This quote helps us understand what she's feeling. Add that to it. I'm going to continue on. But the next morning, her young body, now used to a roof and warm food on cold mornings, pricked and pained her until she awoke. It was raining, and she was a hopeless failure. She stood up, picked some of the leaves from her hair, wiped her drippy nose on her sleeve, and looked around. She knew where she was. Behind her were the village, Emma, the midwife, and Failure. She could not go back there. She could not stay here in the rain waiting to die, for she was too cold and too hungry and uncomfortable and alive. So she went on ahead. The cat stalked behind her, stomach empty and feet wet, but unwilling to let Alice go on without him. An hour's walk brought them to the crossroads where the road from the village met the road to the sea, and there Alice could see, through the wet November dawn, a light. It was an inn. Alice had never been in such a place where anyone could find a bed or a dinner provided he had the coins. Alice did not have the coins, but she had two strong hands and an empty belly to fill, and she was soon at work in the kitchen, trading her labor for bread and a bed out of the rain. Purr made himself useful by keeping mice from the barley and testing everyone's cheese. The inn was really no more than a large stone cottage with a room over a big kitchen, a loft above the stable, and tables in the hall for sleeping on or under. The innkeeper was called John Dark, for he was nearly sightless, but none so blind that he could not find an unattended mug of ale anywhere on the table, or pinch a plump cheek as it passed. Most work about the inn was done by his wife, the round and rosy Jeanette, who could carve a fowl with one hand, turn cream butter with the other, and still have one left to hoist a nosy guest by his shirt front and chuck him out the front door. Ashkins, Baskins, chickadees, Jeanette Jeanette said next day to Alice, "You are such a help to me that I would like you would stay on a while." Alice had nowhere to go, so she stayed, grateful that she had found work and that she was not too stupid to do, even if it was only scouring the tables with river sand or skinning an eel for a pie. Alice worked hard and lived mostly on beans and bread and Jeanette's bad beer. Each week the autumn grew colder and wetter, and the inn, although dirty and drafty, was much cozier than any barn or dung heap to be found outside, so she remained empty of heart. She would not think about her months in the village, or Will Russet, or the bailiff's Joan, or the midwife, for such thinking brought the tickling to her throat again. But sometimes the smell of garbage or of apples baking would make the village so alive in her mind that she would look up quickly, certain she hadn't been magically taken back there again, and her eyes would blink in hope and dread. Sometimes, too, she thought of the boy she had sent to the manor and wondered how he had fared, and if she had at least done that right. Soon it was Christmas, and in the inn teemed with folk going away or coming home. Alice hung holly and ivy from the shard beams in the hall. Musicians with their rebecks and glitterns and sackbuts came to drink and stayed to play. Ducks and geese on great skewers were turned into the roaring fire until they were golden and goosey and so fragrant that the cat and the mice came in from the stables hoping for a bite or two. It was all colorful and warm, but Alice enjoyed none of it. Her heart was heavy, her eyes blank, and her mouth as tight as a hazelnut. She went about the business of Christmas as if she were mucking out a stable, muttering over and over to himself, "I am nothing, have nothing, belong nowhere." January dawned frosty and gray and stayed that way, and Alice stayed too. Just before gray January turned into black February, she noted a thin brown coat back hunched over a table close to the fire and realized she had seen the same brown coat back for weeks now, hunched in the same way over the same table before the same fire. Alice began to watch the man, not knowing he had long watched her, and wondered what could so blight a person so young. He was long and skinny as a heron, with black eyes in his face that looked sad, kindly, hungry, and cold. She thought at first he had the pox, for his long face, long nose, and long yellow teeth were spotted, but it proved to be only ink, splattering as he pushed his quill pen furiously along. "Corpus bones," she thought. "He's writing. That is a man who can write." She kept her eyes down as she served him his bread and ale, barely daring to breathe before the same air, she who was too stupid to be a midwife's apprentice. While they watched, the big sow dropped 7 piglets one afternoon. Jeanette told Alice about the brown-coated man. Magistrate Reese, it was said, was a renowned scholar. Staying at the inn for the winter, he was working off his room and board by keeping accounts and penning letters for guests while he finished writing what he was rumored to be a great and holy book. Alice studied the man. She noticed that John Dark liked to sit near him, for he was careless of his ale that Jeanette made sure to give him the smallest portion or the toughest meat. For he ate what he was given, and he never complained that he never scolded Tam, the kitchen boy, who had been kicked by a horse and was not right in the head, even when Tam spilled beer or bacon fat on his papers, and that only the geese seemed awed by him, scattering hurry-scurry when he entered the inn yard, lest another tail feather go for a quill pen. Alice took to sweeping the corner of the floor more carefully and scrubbing that end of the table more frequently, hoping to see what he had written and what it might look like, for her curiosity overcame at last even her bleak despair. After a while he tried to speak to her, but she would only clutch tighter to her broom and sweep furiously in silence, so instead he took to talking to the cat. "This puss," he said, shifting the sleeping animal off the page he was writing, "is my masterwork, an encyclopedia copendendum I call the great mirror of the universe, whereas you can find reflected all in the world's knowledge collected by myself, Magistrate Richard Reese, M.A., and dedicated to his ampleness the Bishop of Chester. So called, for it is ample in all the world's virtues. Or, see how I can make the ink blacker by mixing soot with the boiled oak galls. Or, this cat is a P as in puss, or pork, or plum pudding. Or, the letter S must be made just so, never thick and wiggly, and with extra curve at the end, but just so. The cat listened carefully, although sometimes he lost patience with the tutoring and began to bite at the tantalizing moving pen. And Alice too listened, so that she learned some letters as the cat learned. She liked best the O, the D, and the G, for they looked friendly. Z seemed mean, X was wicked, and W made her yawn, always made her yawn. Q was by far the most beautiful, she thought, even if it could not stand alone and must be accompanied everywhere by the compliant U. Sometimes at night, when the cat's belly was full and he had no need to prowl about looking for supper, he could let Alice cuddle him against her as they went to sleep and tell more about what she had learned that day. How A began Alice, an apple, an ark, when to put a tail on the S, and what letters might be made to spell purr. Even though he must, she thought, know these things as well as she. During the day, when not boiling or sweeping or chopping or skinning, she wrote letters on the frost on the woodpile with a twig, scraped them into the soot of the chimney wall with the hand of the broom, and stuck her finger in the mutton soup and wrote them on the table in the kitchen. At night she found them written out in the stars in the clear, cold sky. So, readers, Alice is learning how to read, something that somebody of her stature would have never been able to do prior to her kind of learning mysteriously by sitting next to this man, this scholar who's writing this tale, and just learning from him. So she's becoming literate, which at that time was unheard of. As we read on. Once Alice knew all the letters and numbers of combinations, Master Reese began teaching the cat words, reading out loud bits of wisdom from his great encyclopedia. As a result, Alice heard about the heavenly planets circling the earth in hollow, transparent spheres, and the great empire of the Romans that once stretched all the way to Britain. About the faraway island of giant ants who walked upright and mined for gold. She learned about the four humors that govern the body, how to plant corn by moonlight, and where anthropods are. And still he had not said a word to her. When one day he threw away a piece he had ruined with an ink blot, Alice snatched it up and stuffed the stiff venom into her bodice, her dress. Each night before she blew out the last candle, she would labor over the page, picking out letters and sometimes even words that were familiar to her. One showery afternoon, when raindrops sparkled like fairy dew on the new green leaves, Magistrate Reese sat dreaming over his mug of Janet's thin, bitter ale. Winter was nearly over, and his book far from finished. What was he to do next? Should he stay or should he go? What do I want to do? He asked himself. Spying Alice sweeping her way towards him, he asked her, What do I want? And then, pointedly, And what in girl do you want? Alice stopped still. She thought just to sweep away, but the shock of his addressing her directly was lost in that intriguing question. What did she want? No one had ever asked her that, and she took it most seriously. What do I, Alice the inn girl, want? She chewed on a lock of her hair to help her think. What did people want? Blackberry pie, new shoes, a snug cottage, and a bit of land. She thought all that wet afternoon, and finally, as she served Magistrate Reese his cold beef and bread supper, she cleared her throat a time or two, and then softly answered, I know what I want. A full belly, a contented heart, and a place in this world. Master Reese looked up from her in surprise. You ask a lot for an inn girl. I thought you'd say a sweetheart or a yellow ribbon for your black hair. No, this is what I want, but it is my misfortune instead to be hungry, out of humor, and too stupid to be a midwife's apprentice. None so stupid, he said. You can read and write as well as the cat. Alice smiled, and so winter turned to spring. And you should have another place to stop and record. What are you noticing about how Alice is feeling about herself? We'll continue on. Chapter 13, Visitors. Jeanette was well content with Alice. The girl didn't steal food, sneak ale, or dally with the guests. She was strong, willing, undemanding, and she had enough common sense to do what she was bid and ask no questions. So Alice laid fires and swept floors and carried water all that spring. She was learning also to over yeast the bread and weigh the mugs so that much of what she served was merely air or iron. She stirred who knows what poor wild thing into the stew and called it beef or rabbit. When important looking guests arrived and Jeanette called to Alice in a loud voice to put clean sheets on the big bed, Alice knew she was to do no such thing. But the important looking guests overheard and were comforted by the thought. Thundering toads, Jeanette would say. I'm but a poor woman with this wretched inn and a blind man to care for. I'm sure God does not begrudge me my little economies. And she got by with it because she was so round and rosy and merry, and with it all so fair, and that she cheated everyone just the same. As spring burst into May and the trees were all flowers, and Magistrate Reese decided to stay for one more season, there came to the inn a comely young man who acted so lordly, Alice thought he must be a knight or a mayor, but proved to be the carpenter's assistant from the manor. She watched and listened to him, and finally, while serving his mutton pie, was bold enough to ask, "The boy Edward, who arrived at the manor for the thrashing, do you know him? How does he fare?" "Never heard of him." "A little boy near 7, although small and puny for his age." "Never seen him. Maybe he ran off or died or got eaten by a goat." The carpenter's assistant grinned at this with mutton stuck between his lordly white teeth. Alice's heart thumped. Was she too stupid, then, even to have helped Edward? Was he not safe at the manor as she thought, but somewhere unknown and unsafe and unfit? Or did the lordly young man just not bother to notice the small boys? Then on one day, not so like summer, that the apple trees were tricked into fruit, there came another visitor. Alice had just finished watering the beer and was kneading sawdust into the pie crust when she heard the rumble of a cart on the inn path. A load of wood had come from the kitchen, and walking behind the wagon was the red-headed boy from the village, Will Russet. Alice forgot for a moment that she was no longer the midwife's apprentice, but now a failure, and wiping her floury hands on her skirt, ran outside. "Well, Russet, it's me, Alice." "Alice," he called, "we was wondering where you had got to, and were you all right? What be you doing here?" The sunshine faded from Alice's face. "Skinning rabbits and sweeping floors and mucking out the privy. I am the inn girl." "And a prettier inn girl the world never saw," said Will. "Or you would be if you ever got that flour and dirt off your face. Come, talk with me while I unload the cart." Alice spat at her fingers and rubbed her face, but succeeded only in making both face and hands equally dirty. So she gave it up and followed Will to the woodpile, where she sat and listened to his news of the village. Alice Little was fat and bony and had 3 teeth. The baker's wife kept her husband tied on a short rein to his ovens. Grommet Smith and Mary Alden Figtree unstewarded at the manor, a timid little man who called out, Mistress Figtree, my dear," and stayed mostly out of her way for fear of being swatted like a fly. "How you be, Alice?" Will asked when he had run out of gossip. "Why did you run?" Alice thought of what she might say. The village did not suit me, or the midwife was stingy and greedy and harsh, or I found I didn't care for babies. But when her mouth opened, out came the story of her failure with Emma Blunt, and how she discovered that she was too stupid to be the midwife's apprentice. "Blah, Alice, I seen you with Tansy. You got guts and common sense. Just because you don't know everything don't mean you know nothing. Even Jane Midwife herself don't know everything, though she thinks she does," Will said, winking at her with an eye as green as new grass and as friendly as a summer sky. Suddenly shy, Alice ran back into the inn, and the visit was over, though she remembered it again and again during the weeks that followed. Before the month was out, another familiar face showed at the inn. One day when Alice returned from gathering wood sorrel to make a sauce, there at the table was Jane Sharp, the midwife herself, in her starched wimple and second best gown, deep in earnest conversation with Magistrate Reese. Alice's face grew hot and then cold as bare feet in January. Her throat tickled and her eyes stung as she imagined the midwife telling Magistrate Reese of the girl's stupidity, her incompetence, and her failure. Run away, she said to herself, run away! But her shame was less than her curiosity, that and her desire not to leave Magistrate Reese hearing only the worst of her. So she stayed, hiding in the shadows of the room to listen without being seen. Important flag there, if you can find it. Jeanette pinched her and thrust a jug in her hand, so she began to move towards the table as slowly and silently as she could until she was close enough to hear. And I brewed her some of my sage tea, unequaled for a woman likely to miscarry due to the slipperiness of her womb. Jane Sharp was not then talking of Alice, but of herself. Alice should have known. And Magistrate Reese was writing it all down in his great encyclopedia while the cat nibbled his cheese and bread. Jane continued, I myself use of a tea of black alder bark and smut rye to stop excessive bleeding, but I have heard that rubies, either worn on the body or ground into a powder and taken in warm wine, do even better, if the woman is lucky enough to own rubies and rich enough to let them be ground into. She never even noticed Alice as the girl refilling her mug. Alice returned to the shadows. Well rested, she heard the midwife say to Magistrate Reese. A boy from the village tells me my apprentice is here at the inn. My former apprentice, might I say, for she ran away. You've seen her here, skinny girl with black curls and big sad eyes. Afraid to say boo? Before Magistrate Reese could say yea or nay or yea, the midwife went on. She was not as stupid as some. I have had, and better company, but still perhaps her going was for the best. She was not what I needed. Because I failed, whispered Alice in the shadows. Because she gave up, continued the midwife. I need an apprentice who can do what I tell her to, take what I give, who can try and risk and fail and try again and not give up. Babies don't stop their borning just because the midwife gives up. She landed her sharp glance at Magistrate Reese for a moment, drank all of her ale in one swig, and was gone. So if you haven't done your 4 flags for those 2 chapters, please stop and do it now. Again, you are looking for ways that show us how Alice is feeling about herself during these 2 chapters. Really important chapters. Okay? I'm going to continue on with reading chapter 14 and 15 for today. And for today, 4 more flags for these 2 chapters as well. You are going to flag when you notice Alice interacting with another main character in the story. So what does her interaction show us about what Alice is thinking or feeling? Okay, here we go. Chapter 14, The Manor. Just before the road from the inn turns to make for the village, there is a hidden path to the manor. Visitors use the main manor road, crossing through the gatehouse and past the apple trees in the stable. Some of the villagers know about the path, but few use it, for it passes too close to the dark woods. Alice, in her comings and goings to the village, had come upon the path, although she had never before had need to follow it all the way up to the manor, until one afternoon when the golden yellow blossoms first appeared on the labyrinthine trees, and Girdle the cow gave birth to her first calf, a sweet and sticky thing Alice thought to call Rosebud, for she was as red as the hedge roses near the village church. As she walked, Girdle nuzzled and suckled Rosebud and tucked her against her warm body to give the calf her warmth. Alice was filled with a sudden longing to go and see the boy Edward at the manor and see for herself that he was there, fed and dry and content. Mayhap was unhappy and longing for her, and she would bring him back to the inn and take care of him as Gertie did Rosebud. For she was thought about this, and the more she thought, the righter it seemed. She imagined Edward's first sight of her would be the manner. Alice, you had not forgot me, he would cry, throwing his arms about her waist. Have you come to take me away? I pray you have, for I am desolate here without you, and as well am starving and beaten and forced to sleep outside in the snow, and no one cares for me. She would scoop the boy up in her arms, and they would go together back to the inn, and Alice would take care of Edward, and this would make her heart content. All she needed was Edward, and all would be well. She was certain of it. So one day, when Jeanette had gone to the market fair at Edenwick to buy a copper pot, a young pig, and a bit of lace for her best kirtle, and no guest but Magistrate Reese cluttered the table, Alice put the cat in the stable so that he would not follow her, and the sun warming her wintry spirit, climbed to the manor on its gray-green hill. Passing the village fields, she saw Roger Mustard and Thomas the Stutterer swinging their weed hooks, and felt the familiar feelings in her chest and her throat, but turned her eyes away so she would not have to think about what she had had and what she had lost. The manor was bustling in the sunshine, and she first went to the barn, where the men were sharpening hoes and sickles in preparation for the summer hay cutting. "The boy Edward?" she asked a tall, red-nosed man, "the small boy who arrived after harvest to help with the thrashing. Is he still here?" The man turned and looked at Alice. "Forget this, Edward Curlytop. My name is Matt, and I'm 6 times better than the man he is. Climb up here on this hay bale and give me a warm, sticky kiss." "My hair may be frizzled, but my wits are not," Alice responded. "Save your sticky kisses for your wife or your cow." Alice left the barn and went next to the smithy, where the manor blacksmith and his apprentices were hammering lumps of iron into shoes for horses. "The boy Edward?" she asked again. Her answers were rude remarks, laughter, and kissing sounds from men too ill-tempered or too busy or too tired to care about the questions of a strange girl. "The boy Edward?" Alice asked of the kitchen maid skinning a pig in the manor yard, the laundress boiling great kettles of goose fat for soap, the carpenters fashioning a coffin for old Ned, who had died that morning. None answered. "Corpus bones," said Alice. "I might as well be asking the fence." Finally she found her way to the shed that served as the manor kitchen, and there found a cook who, judging from the words pouring from her mouth with none to listen, would not be reluctant to talk to Alice. "Please, ma'am." Alice, who had learned that ma'ams and sir served her well, even with cooks and stable boys, when asking favors. Please, ma'am, the boy Edward, who came after harvest to help with the thrashing, is he still here? Have you seen aught of him?" "Ah, the lamb," the cook cooed, waving her ladle at Alice. "The little lamb. He be here, but too small he is to be swinging that great heavy flail about, or wrestling with the oxen and plows, and the taunting of men. So I try to watch over him, the wee duckling, and find him simple tasks to do, suited for a small boy." The cook sat down, her face red from the heat and emotion and the boiling and stewing going on about her, took off one great leather shoe and used it to fan her face. She peered closely at Alice. "Surely, then, you be the sister he talks about, for you look just like him and could pass for twins." The cook muttered and crossed herself. "You not be twins?" she asked Alice, peering closer. "I cannot abide twins." "No, ma'am, we're not even brother-sister." "Ah, never say that, sweet puddin', for you are alike as two peas, just as so you are not twins." "No, ma'am, not twins," answered Alice again, wondering why twin cows such as Baldred and Bilforth should be such a joy and boon, why twin babies were ill-starred and unlucky. "Well, then, my little turnip, go find your brother in the hen house behind the barn, where I sent him to gather eggs for a parsley omelet, and bring yourself back here for dinner of bread and bacon." The cook wiped her wet red face on her skirt, picked a struggling fly from the great pot of soup she was stirring, and began a new conversation with herself, for she found such talk interesting and hardly ever disagreed with what was being said. Chapter 15, Edward. The manor was growing quiet, preparing for evening and supper and bed, and Alice passed men coming back from the field, weed hooks and hoes and rakes on their tired shoulders, dairymaids washing out their churns, stopping every now and then to lick the sweet butter off their fingers, shepherds bringing in the sheep for tomorrow's washings, and cheering, the music of the pipes rising to the whole wide blue sky and disappearing into the silence. So, seventh graders, I just want to retell you again, that paragraph, Karen Cushman is setting the stage. She described in that whole paragraph descriptive sensory language, figurative language, helping us understand what she saw, what she smelled, what she experienced when she was walking back to the manor. She's heading to the hen house. Around the barn in the hen house, she found Edward, egg basket still empty, kneeling before the chickens. "So then," he said to the largest and most bad-tempered, "you be the king, and you," he pointed at the small hen with the speckled feathers, "be the queen. For you look motherly and kind, and the rest of us will be knights, and we will pretend we are about to have a great battle with the Scots, but we don't mind, for we are sure to be victorious." And that Edward looked up and saw Alice watching him. "Alice!" he cried, leaping to his feet, the better to throw his arms about her waist. "Alice, you have not forgot me!" Alice remembered her, imagining as the boy hugged her, and she smiled. It would be well. "Come, Alice, you can be a knight too, and we will march north to the stable." "Edward, I sent you here to work so you have food and warmth and a place to belong, and instead you're playing knights with the chickens. What be you thinking?" She tweaked Edward's nose and pulled a speckled feather from his hair. "Come, I help you find enough eggs to satisfy the cook, and then we will talk together." "Alice, what you be doing at the manor?" "I came to see how you be, and good thing I did, for you seems to not have the wits of an oat. Your sister, indeed! What are these lies you have been telling the cook?" "Not lies, really, Alice. I just wanted a sister, for all cook's other children have brothers and sisters. Have you come to take me away?" Before Alice could reassure him that she was there to rescue him and all would be well, he continued, "You haven't, have you, Alice? For I am sore content here, and mostly have enough to eat, and when cook is cross with me, I sleep with the chickens and pretend. No one chases me away, and even Lord Arnulf knows my name." So Alice learned about the sometimes mighty distance between what one imagines and what is. She would not be bringing Edward back with her to make her heart content, but she knew she had not failed him, and she breathed a heavy sigh of sadness, disappointment, and relief. It felt so good that she did it again and again until her sighs turned to sobs, and she cried her first cry right there in the henhouse with Edward arming the chickens for battle. Edward patted her shoulders and comforted her as well as a small boy could, and cheered her by wiggling his first loose tooth. On the way back to the kitchen, Edward began a campaign to convince Alice to stay the night, and she agreed, though she knew Jeanette would scold her for her absence, for she was not ready to becoming completely abandon Edward and his rosy imaginings. While they ate their bread and bacon supper, while Alice helped Edward mound up straw in a corner of the kitchen, while she sat by watching for him to go to sleep, all the while Edward talked of life on the manor. He told her of the silken robed lords and ladies who came for feasts and rode out to hunt and dance like autumn leaves in the candlelit great hall, of the visiting knights who clanked their swords against each other as they practiced in the schoolyard, of the masons who slapped mortar and bricks together to build a great new tower at the corner of the hall that looked to stretch near all the way to heaven. He described the excitement of the buying and selling at the great autumn horse fair, the nervous preparations accompanying the arrival of somewhat velvet-shod bishop or priest, and the thrill of watching the baron's men ride out to confront a huge, maddening boar who had roamed too close to the village. And he complained at his lot, doing all the smallest tasks, not being allowed to help with the thrashing and the plowing, being teased for being so little and frail and tied to cook's arm skirts, and fit for nothing but gathering eggs. Finally, as his eyes looked near to closing, he said, "Tell me a story, Alice." "I don't know any stories." "For sure you do. Everyone does." "Well, Jeanette told me the one night a visiting mayor fell out of bed, hit his head, and thought he was a cat. So he slept all night on the on the floor watching the mouse holes." "That's no story, Alice. Cook tells me stories. A story should have a hero and brave deeds." "Well, then, once there was a boy who, for all he was so small and puny, was brave enough to do what he must, although he didn't like it, and he was sometimes teased. Is that a story?" "Close enough, Alice." And he closed his eyes. When the moon shone through the misty clouds and two owls hooted in the manor yard, Edward and Alice slept, each comforted by knowing that others were safe and warm and sheltered, and not too far away. The next day, being the day the woolly black-faced sheep were washed before shearing, Alice and Edward ate their bread and beer breakfast down by the river to watch the great event. Edward finished his breakfast first. "I'm still hungry, Alice, and there's nothing about here to eat but grass. Do you know if grass is good for people to eat?" "Try it." He did. "It'd be good for exercising my teeth and making my mouth taste better, but it tastes like grass," I would say. "Then do not eat it." "What is the best thing you ever ate, Alice?" "Hot soup on a cold day, I think." One Once long ago a monk gave me a fig. It was a wonderful thing, Alice, soft and sweet, and after that I had nothing to eat for 3 days but the smell of the fig on my fingers. Have you ever gone to finishing that bread, Alice? And Alice gave him her bread, which is what Edward wanted, and Alice intended all along. Part of the river had been dammed to form a washing pool, and men stood in the waist-deep water while their hairy shepherds, looking much like sheep themselves, drove the woolly beasts into the water to have their loose fleeces pulled off and then be scrubbed with the strong yellow soap. The river was noisy with the barking of dogs, the bleating of sheep, the calling and cursing of men, and the furious bawling of those lambs separated from their mothers. Edward soon took on the job of matching mothers and babies. He snatched up the bawling lambs and ran from their mother to mother until he made up the right pair, whereupon they would knock him out of the way in their hurry to nuzzle each other. As the day grew hotter and hotter, the river looked cooler, and finally Alice tucked her skirt way up in her belt and waded in. The weary men were glad of another pair of hands, and soon Alice was helping. First she held the woolly black faces while they were scrubbed, but one old ewe took offense at Alice's handling, and standing up with her front feet on Alice's chest, pushed the girl into the water. Alice, coughing and sputtering, traded jobs with the man who was lathering their back. Fleeces clean, then the sheep swam to the bank and scrambled out of the water, nimble as goats and hungry as pigs. By mid-afternoon they were finished, while Edward and the shepherds drove the sheep into their pens across the field. Alice stretched and wiped her wet hands on her wet skirt. What a wonderful wonder, she thought, looking at her hands, how white they were and how soft. The hours of strong soap and sudsy fleece had accomplished what years of cold water never had. Her hands were really clean. There was no dirt between her fingers, around her nails, or ground in the lines of her palms. She sat back against a tree, held her hands up before her, and admired them. How clean they were! How white! Suddenly she sat forward. Was the rest of her then that white and clean under all that dirt? Was her face white and clean? Was Will Russet right? Was she even pretty under that dirt? There never had been one pretty thing about her, just skinny little arms and big feet and dirt, but lately she had been told her hair was black and curly and her eyes were big and sad, and was mayhap even pretty. Alice looked about. The washing was done and the sheep driven to the barn to dry off for tomorrow's shearing. The river was empty, but for great chunks of the greasy yellow soap floating here and there. Alice found a spot a bit upriver from the befouled washing pool, pulled off her clothes, and waded in. She rubbed her body with the yellow soap and a handful of sandy gravel until she tingled. Squatting down under the water, reached her chin, she washed her hair and watched it float about her until she grew chilled. Alice stood up in the shallow water and looked at herself, much cleaner, although a bit pink and wrinkled from her long soap. And pretty? Mayhap even that, for she had all of her teeth and all of her limbs, a face unmarked by pox or witchcraft, and perhaps now more of happiness and hope than of sadness in those big eyes that even the midwife had remarked upon. She washed her clothes, pulled them on still wet and drippy, and ran for the kitchen to dry a bit before the fire. Too soon it was time to bid Edward good-bye. Be assured I will not be far from here, and I promise to come back for Christmas and Easter and your Saint's Day, and to see when that front tooth grows in again. Edward grinned. He had enjoyed the day, done a man's job, and been carried home on the shoulders of a giant of a shepherd called Hal. He was satisfied with his place at the manor, the devotion of the cook, and the friendship of Alice. He suddenly felt not so small. Alice gave him a hug and a smack, and felt the tickling in her throat and stinging in her eyes that meant she might cry again. Now she knew how to do it. She went down the path from the manor, stopping every few turns to turn and wave until finally the path curved and Edward was lost from sight, and all she could see was the way ahead. Okay, so these past two chapters, you were asked to put four posts in when Alice was having an interaction with other characters in our story. So please take those 8 posts that you now have from chapters 12 and 13 and 14 and 15 and take those and write them in your digital notebook, adding them to Wit and Wisdom notes, and just tagging why you chose to, what the quote was and why you chose to use it. What is importance does it have? Okay. Thank you. Have a good day.